Ben Giannis, the Modern Meathead. How are we doing today?
Excellent, man. Thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly.
Of course, every time. Legend has it you have 100% American ground beef tattooed on the sole of your foot. Is this true?
This is not actually true. It was something I was thinking about because I do often eat a pound of beef at a time, which for some sounds crazy, but for me has become a regular thing. But no, not yet, at least at this very moment.
I'll believe it when I see it. What do you think most people misunderstand about the gym?
I like this question a lot. I think that most people view exercise as this like anatomy first thing. So you often see this in the way that we talk about exercise. We say things like, what is this exercise for? And what muscle group am I training? What am I targeting? How do I get big biceps? How do I grow my triceps? But what we don't really talk about is all of the necessary conditions in terms of the physical realities of an exercise to make those things happen. And so I think that the thing that most people are missing is this framework that puts all of the basic physics principles first and sort of ignores the basic physics to focus a little bit more on muscular anatomy and things that are a little bit maybe overly nuanced for the average person to really understand. And so the way I kind of like to think about it is, I'll advertise it as I just told you as like, I'm someone who teaches the anatomy of lifting. And that's the reason that I say it that way is because that's what people are always thinking. If I advertised, my products or my page as the physics of lifting, people would see the word physics and be like, ugh, like, what is this, right? But although it is advertised as the anatomy of lifting, really what I teach is the physics of lifting. And so I think that the most important thing to understand about understanding exercise is that all of the things that we ideally want in terms of outcome for muscular growth, muscular strength, whatever, come from resistance, things that are external to our body, things that are outside of our body. And so the priority that has been given to anatomy is justified in many ways. It's like that's the entry point for most people. That's what most people get into the gym to do, is to improve the way that they look and the way that they feel. But the way that you do that is not actually by understanding muscle. It's about understanding how muscle actually responds to external force. And so exercise is kind of this, interaction between your anatomy and your muscles, your connective tissues, your joints, and external forces. And you can't really actually begin to understand the body without understanding properties of resistance and very, very basic physics principles that sort of underlie how we actually respond in terms of exercise. Because I like to think about exercise as response rather than something that we are creating, right? Muscular contraction is this response to force. It's not something that we will our minds into doing. It's something that occurs as this sort of reaction to what we're dealing with externally, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So can you paint a picture between the average gym goer that more abides to what you are saying, or versus the average modern meathead who understands a little bit of the physics and anatomy going behind it?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that meme that's like, it usually compares two things. It's like average lifter versus like average modern meathead, that kind of a thing.
Okay.
But more from a brain perspective. Yeah, I think a good example, because a really common one in my experience is like this whole framework around mind-muscle connection. So I think the average gym bro will bias all of their training toward feeling particular sensations in muscles. So let's say like someone is struggling to grow their biceps, right? Everyone loves to talk about biceps. That person will sort of create a framework for themselves, which is based around how well do I feel my biceps? How well are my biceps contracting? How sore do they get? Do I get a pump in them? And none of that stuff is bad, but it doesn't really actually give you any degree of understanding or education about what you're doing. It's just this subjective feedback loop that you just end up in sort of infinitely. And so that's kind of the framework that I think most people are operating within. And the framework that this so-called average modern meathead operates in is not how do I train my biceps, but how do I load my elbow joint such that my biceps need to create a muscular response. And that sounds kind of pedantic and almost like it doesn't actually make a difference in outcome. But I actually find that the people who put these sort of principles of physics first end up being able to answer any of these questions that they have about muscle across any context, right? So if you kind of learn the first principles of the physics stuff, you don't go into the gym looking to to be able to squeeze your biceps and feel your biceps, you just have a basic understanding of like, hey, how do I need to perform a motion such that my biceps are the thing that react? And so it's that kind of flipping of like muscle second, physics first. Of course, they're interrelated and you can't understand one without the other. But from a broad strokes kind of a perspective, that's the way that I would kind of, paint the picture in terms of where people are starting versus where I think they maybe should be starting.
Yeah. I think it's such a cool thing, like your account, Chasm, all these people, because when we were coming into the industry, like I remember just going to the gym and it's just these very abstract ideas. I'm going to hit a bicep exercise and you didn't really understand what was happening, or at least I didn't. Maybe you were ahead of me, but you were just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go hit chest. And you didn't really understand why it's incline more chests or than shoulders. Where are my triceps really contracting? It was just like, go hit this exercise for this muscle group, which I think is the point you're alluding to. And
Yes.
it's been so cool to really gain the understanding of like, this is why, like, and once you see the picture as you painted it, it's clear as day. You're like, this is a tricep exercise for, you can get specific, potentially medial head of the tricep or a little bit of external head. And it all starts to come together when you paint that picture.
Yeah, for sure. And also just anytime I always try to contextualize this. Sometimes I'm looking downward and it's because I like to keep little notes. It's not because I'm off tasking or anything, but I just sometimes, when you're speaking, I'll think of things that I don't want to forget about. So I'm just to be clear for anyone who's watching.
No problem.
Yeah, it is that interesting conversation because it's like, if someone assumes that for that sort of muscle centric framework to begin with, they are not able to very often navigate problems when they encounter problems. But the person who, like I said, sort of starts elsewhere, or not necessarily elsewhere, but just at least simultaneous to, right? Like you can learn about all the anatomy stuff because at some point you probably need to. But as long as you're learning the physics stuff in tandem, it's not a problem. And, I'll sometimes ask the question when I'm trying to teach people these concepts, like, what is the difference between, a biceps curl and a triceps extension? And people are very puzzled by this kind of question because they're like, what, isn't it obvious? And I'm like, oh, okay, well, if it's obvious, then like, there should be a fairly straightforward answer. And the answer to that question is, what is the resistance doing to the body, right? If I like go like this with my elbow and I just bend my elbow, you may be biased toward thinking that I'm doing a bicep or a tricep thing, but what makes it so is where a cable is pulling my arm, or where a dumbbell is pulling my arm, or where a machine is pulling my arm. So yeah, the physics sort of centric approach is where I really like to get people to start. And I think that's a little bit tricky at first to get people to buy into, which is why I think simultaneously you at least need to sprinkle some muscle examples in there. But ultimately, yeah, there's no sort of like blanket set of rules that you can follow about muscle that will actually, I think, inform and educate people about exercise as a whole.
Yeah. Where do you think, I think this is something you've come under some criticism for in the past, where do you think science-based lifting goes too far?
Science-based lifting goes too far in two major ways. The first way, and maybe the more common way, is for people using the term science, or really it occurs when people who are using the term science do not understand what the purpose of science is. That's like, I think, the crux of the problem. And just, I'm not explaining this because I think that you don't understand, but for people listening, science is essentially like a field of inquiry, which says or makes the claim that we don't know really what we're doing. So like we have to run these experiments to figure out what we're doing. And the way that science-based is used as a sort of headline for people's accounts or people's programs or whatever, it's used in this sort of weaponized, sort of incorrect way, where people instead are not using it to mean what it actually means. People are using it to sort of prey on the people who don't necessarily understand what the purpose of science is to begin with. Because of course, science is meant to inform, but science is not based on, the facts of the world. Science is built on the facts of the world. But what science does is science essentially attempts to answer questions more than give you sort of blanket solutions to things, right? It's just this iterative process that never ends. And so that's sort of the big picture thing. Number one is when the people using the term don't understand what the term actually is. And then I think the second major place that it goes wrong, and this is sort of part and parcel of the first part of this, is whenever people hyper focus on a single variable, that's when real problems, I think, start to arise, right? So for anyone who's kind of really been paying attention to the quote unquote science-based lifting movement, you will know that like the last year has been the year of let me figure out how to do lengthened partials. And it's not that lengthened partials are bad, and it's not that lengthened partials are good. Lengthened partials simply just are. And as long as you understand what lengthened partials are in the context of every other important variable in relationship to exercise, that's where you end up in what I would describe as like a scientific place. You end up in a very unscientific place when you pick a single variable out of a hat and you say, this is the most important one. Because for anyone who understands any degree of research in any field, they know that like whenever researchers make conclusions in their research, all of the conclusions, or at least most of them, are tentative, right? They say, hey, here's what we found. Here's what we found based on what we think we would find. And here's how it might inform future research, right? It's always this like future informing type of thing. So anytime that anyone makes any super strong claim about any single variable, I think that's like raving the red flag sort of a thing. At least for consumers and your average consumers, is the more certain someone seems, especially in relationship to a single thing without any context around that single thing, that's the time to start to sort of run in the opposite direction, or at least run in a different direction.
Yeah. It's interesting. Science-based has just become kind of a meme. It's like it's it's just as bad as the diet sphere, where where it's like, I'm keto, carnivore, just the name to put on your team jersey.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that it is really unfortunate because the science-based movement has a lot of really, really helpful and I'll say useful tidbits for the average consumer to sort of know about. So, on the whole, I would say like if you're consuming science-based content, you're probably better off than not consuming that content at all. But like all other adventures, if you sort of pick that adventure as your only one and it's the only thing that you pay attention to, you're going to be missing a lot of very, very important things, especially when it comes to resistance training. Because at this point in time, all of the science-based content around lifting, to our first discussion, really only has to do with muscle, right? It has nothing to do with any sort of basic first principle of physics. And that's because the first principles of physics at this point are very well understood. It's not like I'm going to go and talk about moment arm on a reel and people's minds are going to be blown. I mean, maybe some people minds would be blown by that. But for the mass majority of people, they're not looking for information about the things that I think matter the most. They're looking for information about things that they find interesting and that they find to be sexy.
Everyone wants to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
No one wants to talk about moment arms.
No. That's exactly right. I don't really know exactly in the context of lifting what would be the wheel equivalent.
Well, I think like lengthened partials are like kind of like, it's like the new thing. It's like, oh, this is a little bit better than the wheel.
Sure. It's like if someone were to invent like a wheel today that like looked different from a wheel, but it actually wasn't functionally any different. It was just like, oh, we've been using wheels for this entire time, but this one has like this cool, looking rim on it. And so for now, I'm going to put that one on my car because it looks sexier,
Yeah. Where do you see the future of lengthened partials? Do you think it's going to swing back to the short and full range of motion? Or do you think, what I've personally done, and I'll do like some lengthened partials to finish off my sets sometimes, but I'm mostly just trying to do more lengthened overloaded exercises. And I'm still doing full range of motion, but not just doing, some team quarter rep.
Yeah, I would say that where I think it would end up is, as most things do, somewhere, in the middle, where, there will always be your extreme sides of the coin, which is usually based on what people are selling and what people find interesting, which will always, I think, exist. But in the context of lengthened partials specifically, and how I am looking at this now, and how I think that the research will, or where I think the research will point us, is more in the direction of like, hey, lengthened partials are something that you should probably include in your training, but you should probably also include, short position work or full range work. Many exercises, by the way, when we talk about them being full range, end up just being short and biased exercises anyway, like any fucking cable pulling motion. So I do think that we'll end up in a place where the research will sort of elucidate the idea that, and this is speculative, we have some indirect evidence that this would be the case, but I do think that we'll discover that training the full range of a muscle in its entirety, meaning including both lengthen and shorten work, will not end up having this additive effect, but rather this synergistic effect, where we actually see improved strength and muscle growth from training the full end of the spectrum. And intuitively, that just makes sense to me, right? If like a muscle is a string, you can maximize retention at the sort of end range of pulling the string, but you can also maximize retention when the string is shorter. And I think that will probably end up yielding better outcomes in strength, hypertrophy, things like longevity, orthopedic health, and all those sorts of outcomes.
Yeah. I also think that one of the huge issues with any sort of research, right, is that in the short term, like the small picture, if you were to take a lengthened bicep curl compared to a shortened bicep curl, you might see, 10% more growth, let's say, in the lengthened bicep curl, or maybe we add lengthened partials, whatever it is. But in the 2-year scheme, if you just never hit that shortened position, you would probably at year 2, you would probably get more results from switching it up and doing a shortened biased exercise, even though it's not a lengthened partial, just because, we're going to adapt to certain things at different rates. And if you change things up, likely there's going to be some merit to it.
Yeah. And 100%, I think that what you just described speaks to the concept of, novel stimulus. And I do sort of wonder, like in the current research we have, which by the way, there's probably at least 5, and probably depending on what you include, there are probably fewer than 10 studies right now that like really directly are comparing these things, at least fewer than 15. Some people count upwards of 20, but they're not really contextual to what people are talking about. I would say, we'll say there are about 10 studies, that currently elucidate this topic. And I do wonder that, what is the influence simply of the novelty of the lengthened partial stuff versus, to what you're saying, what would be the influence of the lengthened partial, even, 12 weeks down the line? Like, would it yield the same difference in outcome? And again, like, would these things be synergistic if we were to include both, or should we just do one or the other? I do think that it will be, and we'll end up saying that, something in the middle is going to be a little bit better for most people. But I also think that like there are some things that you just can't account for, right? To our earlier discussion of people isolating and focusing on single variables, you're never going to be able to sort of account for all the different moving variables in all scenarios, which is totally fine, right? That's sort of, a piece of the puzzle of how science is conducted. But there are some things that you just literally can't test for, right? It's kind of like the conversation about like injury and exercise. And specifically, one of the analogies I like to think about with this is, can you scientifically assess the validity of like parachutes? Do parachutes work? Well, how would we run a controlled trial, right, to assess if parachutes work? Well, we would have one group of 10 people maybe who jump out of a plane without a parachute. And then we would have one group of people who did have a parachute, maybe another 10 people. And so there are always going to be those sorts of lifting equivalents. It sounds kind of like an extreme, but there are always sort of variables that we simply can't test, at least within a reasonable time frame, right? Like there's no exercise study, at least that I'm aware of in this regard, which can be done for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and so on. So it's a really interesting discussion to me, and I do think novelty is a big part of it.
Yeah. And there's similar things in nutrition where, especially for humans, like you ever heard why it took us decades to figure out why rats didn't get cancer from smoking cigarettes?
Why rats didn't, or why we didn't?
Why? So they believed that for the longest time, they believed that humans didn't get cancer from cigarettes because you can give a rat 10 packs a day and they just don't live long enough for the outcome to happen. Right. If your model is faulty, the whole thing is screwed up, which is just you can't test, you can't do a carnivore test for 10 years because no one's has the money for that. You'd have to cost billions of dollars, and you have to have a bunch of weirdos sign up that were willing to be lab rats for 10 years,
Yeah, I kind of feel like you would sign up to a 10-year carnivore diet. I feel like that's something
will never go carnivore.
You enjoy ice cream too much? Because I enjoy ice cream a lot. So
ice cream, orange juice, carbs are good, man. Steaks are sick though. I'll give carnivores that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That's a great comparison though. I agree, 100% agree.
So we spoke about a year ago.
Wow. A year ago? Holy shit.
Yeah, I may have been a little longer, honestly. But what's the biggest thing you've changed your mind on since then?
It's hard to pick because there are so many things. And, people often will make the commentary, for anyone who's been following, my account for any length of time, they'll say like, wait, didn't you say this thing, 6 months ago? And now like you're saying like, what's that inconsistency about? And I just point people to the concept of like trying to teach people what science is about and what changing your mind is about. So the answer is a lot of things. I would say the biggest thing was what we started off with, was this sort of muscle centric versus resistance sort of external force centric idea. But since we already covered that, I'll be a little bit more specific, and I'll give the example of some specifics maybe around like pec training. I think I've changed my mind a lot on pec training, and I'm not sure if this is like overly down too much of a nuanced, rabbit hole for what your audience appreciates, but I'll say it anyway, which is I used to think that the influence of the rib cage on the pecs was a lot more substantial than it is. And I used to sort of equate from a muscle architecture standpoint, the pecs and the lats a lot. And I think that there are some very, very important differences between the pecs and the lats from a muscle architecture and a function standpoint that not many people seem to recognize or talk about since the whole anatomical pulley thing was discovered, which, by the way, it's not like that was a recent discovery. It was more like a recent popularization. But yeah, overall, my I would say my stance on pec training has been the biggest thing. And I've moved a little bit more away from the sort of hyper-specific approach of dividing and conquering the different pecs. And I've moved more toward a reasonable sort of bro meathead middle ground, where most of your gains will likely come from very, very similar pressing movements. And regardless of how you set up pressing movements, most pressing movements are going to stimulate a vast majority of the pecs, with exceptions sort of on either end of the extreme of, let's say, like an incline or a super extreme decline.
Yeah, that is one place where I think it's very easy to get lost with, your approach, and not just necessarily you, but, and I've done it myself. I'm like, the worst, the doctor's the worst patient sort of thing.
Yes.
Where like, it's like, all right, well, I can hit my coastal pec, I can hit my clavicular pec. Oh, but I'm not hitting my sternal. And it's just like, all right, well, I have to go to the gym 6 days a week, 3 times each day to hit my every fiber of every muscle. What do you think is the approach to balancing that?
Yeah, so I have kind of moved toward as has sort of been a theme here, toward a more reasonable middle ground where I actually divide my pec work into only 2 categories. One category is upper shelf, we'll say middle of the sternum up, and another category is sort of lower shelf. And I think both of those things get captured very well with 2 kinds of presses. One kind of press, which is a little bit more done on what is normally considered a decline angle with a little bit of maybe a tighter arm path. And then one of which is sort of done maybe on more of a flat angle or somewhat of an incline angle, which is done with a little bit more of a wider arm path. So I kind of divide up by upper portion of the pec training, lower portion of the pec training, and then sort of in concert with those, wide arm paths for the upper half of the pecs, and then narrower arm paths for the lower half of the pecs. Okay.
So you would say the principle of that is just trying to distill it down to like what you actually really need.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Right. And to your point, I was also once in a place where it was like, well, I need to be doing the lengthen position of this muscle, and then I need to do a short position exercise. And I need to balance that volume so it's about 60-40 or 70-30 to the lengthen position. And I need to do that for each of the pecs. Technically speaking, you could divide the pec up into way more than 3 portions. You could make the case that there's like 5 or 6 portions. And so at that point, it's like, we start to dive maybe a little bit too deep for the sake of practical use. And especially, as a communicator, like as an information communicator, that was something that people just got super confused about, that didn't end up really helping anyone. So it kind of started from that point where I recognized that there were all sorts of questions that I just thought were totally irrelevant to practice. And I was like, okay, there's something in the way that I'm communicating about this topic that is confusing, or that people can't really seem to wrap their heads around. Let me like take a step back and just start to, sort of work more backwards from the physics stuff. And let me just try to make this make sense from a much more sort of simple, like, let me just divide this in 2 halves kind of a place. And, I'm not super keen now on doing a lot of the single arm pressing type stuff just for, stability related reasons. I've seen that go wrong way more times than I've seen it go right. But that's a sort of generalized rule, not something I would apply to everyone.
Yeah. Those are almost impossible to teach, I've found. unless you're like with someone right there.
Yeah, and even if you are with someone, usually there are two types of people. There are the people who, there are way more than two types, but just to name two, there are the people who will sort of work through the mud with you and be really willing to like make adjustments, drop load when they need to, try new techniques that feel awkward. And then there are the people who will try something for the first time and be like, this doesn't feel right. I don't want to do this. And most people are the latter kind of person, at least in my experience, and especially in the general population. So I've moved much more toward like, hey, let's just find a reasonable sort of middle here, but we can accomplish most of these things with way fewer complications and exercises.
Yeah. From an outside perspective, I would have said the biggest change is your view on the importance of anchors. You see, and maybe that wasn't about a year. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. But can you dive into exactly what anchors are and why they're so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So an anchor is much like it sounds. Essentially, it's just an object that limits the potential for motion, right? So if you think about what you know an anchor is just this thing that people who are on a boat put into the ocean so that the boat doesn't move all over the place. And the purpose of the anchor in that case is to hold the boat still, right? And so let's say you're going out into the ocean and you're going to go fish or whatever, and I'm not a fisherman, so fishermen out there, please excuse my ignorance if there is any here. But you go out into the middle of the ocean and you tie your boat to a buoy, or you throw an anchor in the water and you go fishing. And the reason you do that is so that you don't have to concentrate on driving the boat and navigating the boat at the same time, that you're trying to navigate the process of fishing. So an anchor in an exercise, you can think of simply as just something that is external to the body, that is also hopefully immovable, that limits the motion of our bones in specific defined directions so that we can accomplish a specific task. It's really that simple. And from a physics standpoint, for any physics nerds out there, you can think of anchors in the same way that you think of these things called counter forces. And a counter force is simply just a force which we'll say creates stability or limits motion within a system. So one of the easiest examples that I actually like to use, I think I was on a live stream, and I don't know if this was you or someone else. It doesn't matter. One of the easiest examples to visualize is opening a can of seltzer, or opening, let's say, like a soda can, where people, when they open cans of soda, will naturally do a couple of things to create counterforces so that they can open the can, right? What you do see is people grab the can with one hand, they plant their thumb on one end of the can, they use their index finger to grab the tab, and then they pull the tab up with all that other stability. What you do not see is people putting the can on the table, taking their index finger, and then just trying to peel the tab up, right, to open the can. That would be ridiculous. So you can think about anchors in exercise in the exact same way that you think about anchors opening a seltzer can, where you grabbing the can with your hand and then planting your thumb, those are things essentially that you do all the time in exercise to make sure that you're not just moving all over the place like Gumby when you're trying to, accomplish any given goal, right? So a very simple, practical example here to get to maybe something more concrete is like an example of an anchor is, a thigh pad on a lat pull down. Another example would be using a bench, to do a preacher curl. Another example would be using a thigh pad, on a leg curl machine to make sure that you can do the leg curl. And I do think that when it comes to this discussion, it gets overly simplified because we're also privileged and used to having machines and pieces of equipment that can anchor for us, that we don't even really realize what's happening as it's happening. And then when we start to get a little bit more nuanced about these things, all of a sudden people lose their minds and their heads explode. A good example would be like if I were to strap like a rope around the front of my arm, to do a triceps extension, that is all of a sudden like, an offense on the lifting gods. But for some reason, doing a preacher curl or using any machine ever is totally fine. So those are some practical examples. I don't know if you had any sort of points that you wanted to touch on there or additional questions about it, but that's kind of the overview.
Yeah. I mean, it's really in essence something to push against, right? Like you have a bench and you're doing a dumbbell press. It's a lot easier to do a dumbbell press, than standing up where you're just trying to press the dumbbells out for a number of reasons. One, you don't have anything to push against, so you have to like lean back as you push the dumbbells forward, but also you're moving in the opposite direction of gravity.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and it's kind of like to Newton's first law, right? With every, right, I think it's the third law. Every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So anytime that you push or pull in any direction, your entire body will be influenced by that push or pull. Now, the magnitude of how much your influence will change depending on what you're doing, but no one sits down, or hopefully no one sits down. That's wrong. I've seen people do this. People will sit down on a lat pull down machine and purposefully not use the thigh pad. And you end up with this weird looking thing where people are doing like part of a pull down and then their body's getting pulled halfway up. And then they're trying to pull themselves down with their abs and their hip flexors, right? And so fundamentally, I think the principal takeaway there is anchors in exercise are these external objects that we use to target the tissue that we're trying to target. And that's really as complicated as it needs to be. Now, each specific use case and each specific exercise will be different depending on the forces of the exercise. But overall, that's the sort of broad, viewpoint.
yeah, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, like I was doing the overhead tricep extension for years, and you finally made a video on the anchors for that, and that one is just like money. Like a lot of them, you don't, certain movements you need. Like if you really want to do a lengthened bicep curl, you just really can't even consider it unless you have something to anchor against, right?
Mm-hmm.
The having something to push against for tricep work seems to just be miraculous for my elbows. They just feel so much better, and it's weird because I don't necessarily feel the same way about almost any other exercise, but like the pushing, put it in bench, using whatever, like the tie down thing that you have, all great solutions to just really milk out some triceps.
Yeah, that's one of the things that like I tried to really mentally masturbate around in terms of like conceptualizing why because exactly what you just said about the triceps thing is the same thing I've heard from, at this point, probably like more than 50 people. And it's very interesting insofar as like trying to understand why that happens. Because who knows, pain is so complicated, discomfort is so complicated. But I do find that to be the overwhelmingly the overwhelmingly most popular example of people going from a motion that feels like shit to then it feeling like perfectly refined. And to your comment, I actually would think that, and you can tell me what you think about this, that I think that most of the time people are already anchoring exercises a lot more than they already know. And the ones where people observe a massive difference aren't really the ones that are necessarily special. They're just the ones that are a little bit more difficult to set up, right? Like no one is going to go into a gym and unconsciously lay down on a bench and do a triceps extension with their arm on a bench. But most people, they sit on the preacher curl machine and they just have a pad there. So I think it's less a matter of just the specific use case and rather just how accessible the different use cases are. In the case of a preacher curl, you often don't see people, just holding their arm out in front of them and doing biceps curls that way, right? You see them using benches at least most of the time. The time.
I agree with you, but I would add on to that I think your video today was a great example about racking the dumbbells into those things that just like chop off your fingers. It's like most people don't ever think about that, which is just a reality. It's not, I don't necessarily think it's a good or a bad thing, but it's just like, I saw that video. I was like, Dad, I'm an idiot. How did I not think of this years ago? But like when you have like clients and you make a small adjustment for them on the preacher curls, I really want you to like kind of use your lats here and just pull into the pads. There's zero space. And now it's a subtle difference, but it feels much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I think that much to your point and what you're alluding to, the magnitude of the difference that people feel will depend on how much force there is on not involved joints, right? Like doing a dumbbell curl with your arm just at your side is not going to place a super high amount of stress on your shoulder, but trying to do a preacher curl without a preacher bench with a dumbbell, is going to be unusually taxing on the shoulder relative to the elbow. And to our earlier conversation, that's where you see a lot of these principles in terms of the length and partial stuff going wrong. Is I have a video queued up now. I don't know when it'll be out, in probably like a week or 10 days or something, where this guy, and this will be counter to my earlier point, this guy grabs a dumbbell and he's like, don't do curls with your arms at your sides. That's a waste of time. Instead, because you want load in the stretch, you should hold your arm forward in front of your body and without any pad. Like you should hold your arm forward, right? And do the curls that way because there's load in the stretch. And that's a really good example of where someone is completely ignorant of all the very important and interacting variables that go into a single exercise that are not just length of the muscle or tension in particular positions of that muscle. So, contrary to my earlier point, people do that stuff when they try to make gross extrapolations of research, and that's a really good example of where that kind of thing can go wrong.
Yeah, I like those kinds of examples because in some sense he's not wrong, right? Like that you will get more of a stretch if you put the bicep out in front of there, but he's just going about it in the completely wrong way because you need something. You can't just hold your bicep out there and expect to have the similar amount of force. You need something to push against the anchor, as you send the preacher bench, whatever it is. But like he's just like solely focused in on stretch based hypertrophy or biasing the length and position. That's all he cares about, and he's completely missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and just to clarify that too, he's what he's trying to do is, it's kind of funny, and it speaks to, I think, the ignorance around it, which is he's actually stretching the muscle less, but he is putting more load on the muscle in a shorter position. So he's actually shortening the length of the muscle, putting more stress in the length and position. But by doing that, he's actually, from the perspective of the shoulder, he's actually magnifying the shoulder forces at 2 to 3 times the rate that he's magnifying the elbow forces. And this is just common sense too, right? Like people do front raises with dumbbells for training their front delts, right? They don't do front raises with dumbbells to train their biceps. So yeah, these gross extrapolations are unfortunate in some sense, but I am very fortunate given the position that I'm in, because I can make an infinite amount of reaction reels, to the stupidity.
Yeah, it's good for you. So what do you think, what would you like to see when you walk into the average gym, like the people doing differently, like in terms of using anchors? And like, it's actually the worst for me. I actually hate all of your content because now everyone's using all the cables and I'm just like, dude, I've been on this for like 5 years. Get out of here. I'm being facetious, but like what do you see in the gym? And you go to, I know you have like 18 gym memberships, but you're like, dude, this just blows my mind. Like I want to go up to you and tell you like, please don't do this, but obviously you're not doing that. I know one of them is the combination of the 2 cables into the one, which is a sin against humanity. But
yeah. I've loosened up on that one just a little bit because I've harped on it so much. And usually when I harp on things, it's more to kind of like make a funny commentary about it than it is to say that this thing is like bad. But then people start to assume that I hate it or that it's terrible. Excuse me. But what are some other good ones? So one of them I'll say is personal trainer specific, actually. And one of them is just like your normal gym bro on your own. So I'll give 2 examples. The one that bothers me the most in the context of personal trainers, because even if you're not at a private training gym, which I am most of the time, people in, we'll say like commercial gyms, like an Equinox or like a Crunch, there's still a lot of personal trainers walking around like coaching people. And my biggest pet peeve is just the over explanation of things. And that probably pisses me off because I used to do it, but I'll often hear people like personal trainers who are learning a lot of information. What they'll do is they'll try to teach their clients the information that they themselves are learning, to the detriment of the client's performance and their ability to learn an exercise, right? So if you're teaching someone a biceps curl, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the dumbbell and be like, hey, you see this thing that I'm doing here? Just try to do that thing. Okay. That's the extent of my instruction initially. Right. But the person who's maybe thinking 20 steps ahead of that point will say, okay, you see what I'm doing here? Like I'm going to put the biceps in a more lengthened position because that's going to be better for the muscle. Right. And then I'm going to make sure that my shoulder moves and I'm going to retract my shoulder blade. And then I'm going to curl in a forward arc first, and then like an arc that's more toward my arm. And then what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to let so there's just like 1,000 things that are introduced at once, none of which the client, like all of it goes over the client's head. I see it in the client's eyes, just like deer in the headlights. And so all this information just completely misses the forest. Right. So that's number one. It's just the overcomplication, which is always contextual, right? There are some people who are crazy and they want to ask all these questions. That's fine, right? That's obviously a specific use case. But the other one in general is really just, it's not necessarily it's not really, I see it manifest in people exercising commonly, but it's more so this sort of ideology, which says that like using external objects to exercise is like evil. I think we might have talked about this last year when we talked, but the whole functional movement and just the idea that like things like using our body weight is the best thing. Doing deep squats are the best because they're functional. Doing single leg unbalanced exercises, those things are the best. All of that sort of falls for the same trap, right? Which is this sort of muscle focused trap and this ideological sort of subversion that occurs when people learn like any amount of information about the body, where it's like you end up just with all of these gross extrapolations of maybe concepts that at one point had validity, but in application to exercise now no longer make sense because you're either trying to do 20 things at once, and as a consequence of that, you're not doing really anything effectively at all. So I think maybe to summarize that or to simplify that, I think the way that this translates is people trying to do exercises which requires them to do more than really just one thing at a time. So it's like people trying to turn a regular biceps curl into this crazy BDSM looking like supination curl, and there are tons of examples of that, most of which are like body weight related, which again doesn't mean that body weight exercises are bad by any stretch of the imagination. But if you have ever trained any beginner client in your life, you'll know that people are awful at managing their own body weight. And for anyone that is untrained, especially, people are not prepared to handle their own body weight in a majority of instances. So those are the kind of two main things that I would say, but they both are sort of similar, right? In that there's this there's just too much going on, right? Just whittle it down, simplify it, like swallow your ego, and try not to become this like educator or teacher until it's actually necessary.
Yeah, it's like the whole idea you can't hold two thoughts at the same time.
Right, exactly. Thing. Yeah.
Two things based off that. One is a famous New Jersey wrestler. You probably know him. I won't name names, but he was doing some push-ups, but he had like little mini Bosu balls under all 4 feet and his hands, and it was something like that. And I was like, wow, that's super impressive. Absolutely useless, but like it's a party trick, right? Like it's like me doing like a muscle up. Like it's super cool. It doesn't get me anywhere in life. No one's hiring me because I can do a muscle up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my friends were like, dude, he's a D1 wrestler. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, dude, like this is just such a logical fallacy. I was like, you're right. He is a D1 wrestler. I don't know where that lands the argument, or moves us forward here, but it's just super funny because it's like he's like, this is functional as bro. It's like, okay.
Yeah. The same thing occurs like in every professional. Like it's so rare that I see a professional and this could just be like, another cognitive sort of bias in that the only professional athlete training videos that I see are the ones that go viral, which are usually the dumbest in application. But recently I came across a video of LeBron James, who most people probably know, training, and he was doing like, I think it was either Bosu ball or TRX push-ups with Bosu balls under his feet. And you would be shocked at how many people messaged me. Maybe you wouldn't be shocked based on your experience. And we're like, dude, like he's LeBron. He's been doing this for over 2 decades. Like, don't you think there's something to this? And I'm like, yeah, there might be something to this. But it certainly could just be the fact that he's LeBron and that the only thing that he needs to do in the gym is to actually just not get hurt, So that might actually be something that's beneficial in that he's doing a bunch of exercises, which he really can't load to any degree that would actually be appropriate level to how much, torque around his joints he could generate. So I think that whole concept is fascinating. And it certainly is exacerbated by professional athletes and the specific videos that they create or that they are in, which tend to go viral more often than not, which are just the sort of dumbest combination of things that you can imagine.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's just a tendency for some of potentially the worst personal trainers to work with some of the best athletes in the world?
So here's a theory, and I'll communicate this as a theory and not as fact. I think that the trainers that are the least educated in the most important realms, meaning if you're a trainer, it's most important first that you are educated in the realm of exercise, meaning anatomy and physics. Okay. Mm-hmm. You can make the argument that there are a lot of other important variables, but I would make the argument that that's the most important because you are literally dealing with someone's physical health in real time, right? So that's the most important to me, is to know what the fuck is going on about the body and about the physics. And the trainers I find, we'll say celebrity trainers, are generally speaking, the people who have the least amount of relative knowledge in that domain, but they have the most amount of knowledge in the domain of dealing with people. And it's kind of like, you can only put your energy into so many places. And if you're really good at this one thing, which is interacting with people and talking to celebrities and getting people to buy into your bullshit, then you don't really need to check the other boxes, right? It's kind of like you're getting clients, you're getting paid an enormous amount of money. And so like, why bother? Right. And if you were that person, you would probably be operating, and I would be operating the same way, which is like, hey, I'm successful. These famous people are paying me. Why would I need to invest any more time than I already do, which is probably none at all, into learning about, these other things that may actually benefit me. So I think it's just a consequence of, or rather an outcome of necessity. It's like, what do you actually need to improve at to improve results? And for some people and some trainers, the results are simply just, is this person coming into the door and paying me? It's not, hey, what are the outcomes that this person is actually experiencing? So I think it's kind of like those two things are the same thing, where, and I'll make an analogy here in a sort of adjacent realm, where a lot of the people who are incredibly genetically gifted, because of their genetic blessings, they do not need to invest their time and effort into areas that other people eventually need to in order to see progress. So I was not someone who, out of the womb had like capped delts and a six pack and all that stuff. And I was someone who was just constantly getting hurt in the gym. Whereas, Joe Schmo, who's an elite athlete now, just never had to bother with any of that stuff, regardless of what they did. They didn't get hurt. They saw the progress. They got bigger. They got better, whatever. And so there was just never a need for them to really invest any time elsewhere. So I think those two things are actually the same. And I think that's why we see a lot of the outcomes that we do in that particular realm.
Yeah. It's almost like you don't want to hear the advice of what someone's doing now when they're already successful. You want to hear the advice they did to become successful. So, and what I mean by that is the trainer that's training LeBron, like he doesn't really need to do anything. LeBron is already LeBron James. As long as he doesn't get LeBron hurt, as you alluded to before, he's pretty much winning. Yeah. I'm sure there's some injury proof and there's some, I probably wouldn't be doing the push-ups and the Bosu balls if I was training LeBron. But
yeah, maybe just, and who, like in that case, I'm like, come on, just do like, what's wrong with a normal push-up? I mean, please, just do the normal, and that connects to the overcomplication thing, right? Is like, people view the greater the complexity as like the better the outcome, when I think in terms of exercise, it's almost always the exact opposite of that.
The thing is though about, and this is where functional training has some truth, right? Like if my goal is to, I don't know, to do a push up on 4 mini Bosu balls, that's the best exercise for me.
Yeah.
But it's like people don't understand that functional training, most people just want to get bigger muscles, or most people, if you want to get basically anything else out of your time in the gym other than learn to balance on 4 Bosu balls and do push-ups, that's probably the worst exercise you could do.
Yeah, and I often find that like most, most goals lead back to, how can I just build muscle? That's what most goals lead back to. Whether people are aware of that or not, like, sure, maybe you may have the goal, which is I want to get better at this crazy activity. But for the vast majority of people, if you dig deep enough, I do find that the answer ends up being I want to grow muscle. Whether it's because they want to look better, be healthier, or a combination of the two. And that is something that can be answered very simply, right? It doesn't need to be sexy and Bosu ball-esque.
Going off of that, I think we talked about this last year, but I'll ask you again. What do you think is the difference between training for size and strength?
So I'll start by repeating the common quip of strength is specific. So people who are training for, quote, strength are always doing it, whether they are aware of it or not, relative to a specific motion. So in the same way that you can have a goal of getting stronger at the bench press, you can also have a goal of getting stronger at a cable fly, right? Or something like that. And so strength always exists within the context of muscle growth, but the muscle growth framework does not always exist in the context of strength, because pursuing strength is pursuing strength in a particular activity. And saying that like, oh, I'm getting stronger, right? We kind of know what that means, but it doesn't really mean anything at all. Like, what is that? What do you, strength being specific to a skill means by definition that you have to contextualize it to an activity. So strength always exists within the context of muscle building, but muscle building and the framework around it does not always exist in the context of strength. So I almost always think that the discussion around the two and the confusion around the two is really more so of a framework or a framing issue than it is an actual like X's and O's issue. And what I mean by that is most people who train for muscle size, they get stronger in all the activities that they're doing for muscle size. And most people who train purely for strength, they're usually just implying that they're trying to get stronger at this thing for this given rep range. And so you often see people like in powerlifting and all the concepts in powerlifting about getting stronger in squat, bench, and deadlift sort of leaking into the realm of hypertrophy. And we're led to sort of think that these things are very, very distinct. but you can grow in a vast majority of rep ranges. Now, whether or not you would want to choose one rep to grow in the context of a hypertrophy program is a little bit of a different story, right? That wouldn't make too much ecological sense. But just in the general sense, strength is always, to me, defined by activity, and muscle growth is not. So it's really just about like what you're measuring and how much effort you're putting into that thing on any given day or within any time frame, rather than it being something like this that's just this hard line where there's no overlap. There's a ton of overlap. It just depends on what the outcome you're trying to go for is, and specifically, how you're measuring that outcome. Because as many people are familiar, the biggest guys in the world are very often the strongest guys in the world. Like, I have no idea where this concept of, all these big bodybuilders, they're lifting like super light weights. It's like, if you watch any IFBB pro train, most of them are just like beyond strong, right? My training partner is inconvenienced by how strong he is. He constantly, most of his program is working around how strong he is on any given motion, right? But to say he's strong in general is not to say anything specific, but to say he can lift 200 pounds for 50 reps on a leg extension, that's a more specific sort of pointed story about strength and how that relates to hypertrophy.
Has your view changed at all? That basically, if you're trying to train for strength, you're really looking for more of a skill component than a purely hypertrophy component. But that's where I would say the difference is, right? If you're training purely for size, you're still trying to get as strong as possible, just in a different rep range potentially. Versus if you're trying to train for strength, you still want to gain as much muscle as possible. You also are looking for more neurological adaptations, more skill development in that movement, correct?
100%. And I think, as you can probably glean, I'm a very big fan of analogies. And you ever heard the quip of is it all squares are rectangles, or is it the other way? Is it
all squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares?
Right. So in the same way, thank you for clarifying. My geometry is not great. In the same way, all muscle building programs are strength training programs, but not all strength training programs are made for the goal of or include muscle building programs, right?
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good way to put it. In the fitness industry right now, and I would be curious, where do you see your target audience? Because to me, you're kind of like this is probably a big compliment, I hope, kind of like an Alex Hormozi.
Okay.
Because Hormozi, in his books, he's like, it's really easy if I tried to make or wrote a book for CEOs, because it's like I can write this and I can write all this technical jargon. It's really hard for me to make the same book for the CEO and the person that's just bought their first LLC. And that's kind of where I think you are, because I've been doing this for 10 years. I still get a lot out of your content. And I think someone walking into the gym for the first time can equally get as much out of your content. So where is your target audience, and how do you see like what your message fitting into the world? What's the message you want to put on a billboard somewhere?
Yeah. So I really appreciate the comparison. I'll absolutely take that. And I would say it's very similar in just the exercise realm. So, I used to try to be much more specific about who I was talking to. At first I was talking to the person who was kind of like the intermediary representation of like someone who's in rehab and someone who's training. So kind of the people who were hurt crowd. And then I sort of moved on to more generalized hypertrophy crowd. Like, hey, if you want to grow muscle, this is for you. And then I moved on to, hey, if you're a personal trainer, I can teach you how to, train your clients with more effectiveness. But now I've come around to just a little bit more of a generalized approach, where rather than trying to make my messaging super specific, I'm just going to talk about the topics that I like to talk about and that I feel comfortable talking about. And if any one of those categories of people comes to me, then that's like the best case scenario, right? Because I'm just optimizing for what I like to do and what I like to talk about and what I feel good about talking about. So, as I mentioned to you before, I'm just talking to the person who's interested in understanding exercise mechanics. That would be the sort of umbrella viewpoint that I have. And sort of on maybe a secondary level, like anyone who's really interested in learning about anatomy, but ultimately learning about anatomy for the end goal of better understanding exercise. So the overall thing is like, I want to talk to people who want to understand exercise and get better at exercising. And that is a sort of a secondary and complementary thing. I want to talk to people who are interested about anatomy and who are interested about growing muscle.
Do you think you'll ever get sick of talking about anatomy, biomechanics, and physics?
You know, I've been running on this stuff. I don't know. I guess I'm 24 now, close to a decade just in terms of my personal study. I obviously have not been making content that long. I wouldn't anticipate it. I wouldn't predict it. I would not say that I would ever get bored of it. And the reason that I would not get bored of it is because at this point in time, I do feel like I'm still learning a ton of things. What specifically I'm learning is a lot more subtle in terms of, it's not like I'm learning about where muscles attach at this point, but I'm more so learning, about how a very specific application of a concept that I've been teaching lands for someone, and maybe more so in the way of like trying to improve my communication around that. And the one thing that I've learned for sure, and I'll sort of add this as a third part of the answer to the question about what have I changed my mind on. I actually find that a really good barometer for learning, or rather a really good barometer for figuring out what you need to learn more about or sort of hone in on more, is whether or not you can explain something super clearly. So if there's any amount of sort of nebulousness in the way that I'm communicating a concept, even to someone who is really familiar with the concepts, if I sense in myself, if I pay attention to the way that I feel when I explain something to someone, I'll sort of identify, like, am I in a flow state where all these things are I'm just vomiting all this information and it's landing perfectly? Or am I in a state where I'm kind of like, how do I explain this? Inertia, right? So when I start to identify those things that I'm a little bit choppier on, I just go in that direction until I get to a point where I can explain it to, my fiance, who doesn't study any of this stuff, and where it will land very easily, with her or sort of someone like her, and the people in my family, and so on. So I don't anticipate that I'll be bored, because I think there's always new things to discover and new areas to sort of dive into in relationship to where I'm falling short. But you never know. Who knows? 5 years from now, I could be, much more interested in fishing, and maybe I'll become a fisherman.
That is the theme of this episode.
I guess so.
Yeah, that brings me back to one of my favorite lessons from one of my old jiu-jitsu instructors, was that if you want to improve at offense, go with someone better than you. If you want to improve at defense, go with someone worse than you. And it just kind of, I think it applies to everywhere, because it's like, you want to learn, basically, to talk to someone smarter than you. But if you want to clarify your own learning, talk to someone that's worse than you and see if you can teach.
Yeah. And I think that really hits home for me. And I read recently this Warren Buffett quote, which was really, really appropriate to this, which is, if you have he has this concept of like the circle of competence, and which it seems you're familiar with.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, so basically it's exactly what it sounds like, which is, imagine that you just draw a circle, and within the circle are all the topics that you feel comfortable and confident communicating to yourself and to others. And sort of that's like your circle of competence. That's what that's what you can explain well. And then outside of that is sort of like the sphere of incompetence, right? And the goal should be to first identify what is in the circle and sort of stick to what's in the circle, because just by focusing what is within the circle, you actually end up expanding the circle anyhow, which is kind of counterintuitive. But per the example that I just gave, if I'm explaining the concept of like inertia to someone, and I find that, I'm like 80% sure about like, inertia's resistance to change, but maybe I don't have a good example, I'm going to pursue that sort of specific topic. And eventually, and to your point, I'm going to go to someone who knows more about that topic than I do, who can explain it better than I can, whether it's a textbook, a mentor, or whatever. Or maybe it's just old notes that I had taken from XYZ course X amount of years ago. And I'm going to learn from that person and sort of expand my circle by accident in a sort of non-intentional way, where eventually I end up with a bigger circle. But it wasn't because I tried to move outside of it intentionally. It was because I looked at I really looked at what I thought was in the circle, that I then realized was not in the circle. And the circle has to sort of expand, as a consequence of that.
It's a great way to think about it. I like that. In honor of our favorite podcaster, what is the Giannis razor in terms of identifying good content creators and like and people like, so let's say you're trying to learn about nutrition or physics or something fishing, actually. Hey, what do you look for if you were to just dive into fishing in a content creator that shows to you that they actually know what they're talking about and are producing valuable information? And what do you not want to see as well?
So, I'll answer both parts of that with one thing, which would be in the word context. So, context is like one of my favorite words in the dictionary, and it's also one of my favorite things to annoy people about, specifically my fiance, who sometimes she'll make a statement about this thing that she learned, she didn't really learn, but she heard it from someone else and she's sort of repeating it to me. And I'll ask like one follow-up, and there's usually not a rational explanation about the follow-up. And so the inability to provide more context around a claim, whether you're asked a question or whether you're responding to a comment or whatever, the inability to provide context is a clear sign that you are stepping outside the domain of your sort of competence circle. So that doesn't mean that in a 60-second reel, you need to contextualize every minor aspect of every little thing that you say, but it does mean that there should at least be some degree of nuance to your communication that shows people that, like, hey, this person is saying something, but they're not saying everything that they know, right? If it seems like all of the statements that they're saying are these really gross extrapolated sort of absolute statements about a particular thing, such as, hey, don't do curls this way, do curls this other way, right? And upon being asked a question, they don't really have any ability to sort of dig a little bit deeper. That's like the biggest red flag to me. And there's no way, just based on the sort of medium of, let's say, Instagram and the limitations that the medium provides, that you're going to be able to always contextualize everything, right? That's just a limitation of the medium, and you have to accept that. But what you can do, and I'm sure you specifically have noticed this about me over the years, which is I used to be much more comfortable with making sort of certain strong statements. And now I really just stick to what are the objective qualities of things, and how do those objective qualities relate to what people describe as their end goal. So I try to make all of my content really about the information. And to be honest, I think that's a very simple and effective way to go about it, because you're not making absolute claims. You're not saying this is always this way. You're not saying that this will be right for everyone, but you're just describing an objective reality. You're just describing the facts of a particular scenario. And you're saying, hey, in this particular context, these are the facts, and you can do with it whatever you want. The second that people start to tell other people for certain what they should do, right, to the point about context, that's when things, I think, go downhill for me. And the second that people start to combine a lot of absolute and certain statements as if they are facts, which most of the time they're not with these people, that's when I start to like wave the red flag. And that's when I start to get a little bit more hesitant about listening to someone. So, I don't know shit about fishing, but if I heard someone, who was supposedly an expert fisherman say that this is the one single technique that you need to use whenever you're catching any fish, immediately, I'm throwing flag on the play, because they may be right in some context, but I know that based on a single statement, sort of isolated for that statement alone, that they cannot possibly be right across, all contexts, right? So yeah, we're ending up with a lot of talk about fishing here, and I'll contextualize. Yeah, I'll contextualize, because that's the word of the hour here. That I don't know anything really about fishing beyond just that if someone is talking about it and they're telling me exactly the way that I should do something in every possible scenario, which can't really be done realistically, that's a problem, and that needs to be addressed, at least in my opinion, in terms of what content creators are doing. And the last thing I'll say about this is that if I'm going to make a claim, like a claim that I know to some degree is subjective or based off my own experience, I always say, in my opinion, or in my belief, or whatever
qualifying
else.
It. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I think that a lot of content creators, potentially because of the fact that they can't provide more context, don't provide more context in their caption. And what I try to treat the caption as is a space for context. So if something in my post I identify to be a little bit strongly worded, what I'll say in the caption is, hey, this caption is for context. Here's what you need to know about this. And I'll try to lay out a little bit more of a reasonable framework there. So I like that idea of like caption is for context, and reels and, the sort of body of the content is for just the major message.
Yeah. It just thinks that most of the angry people on Instagram can't read.
Or they either can't read or they don't quote unquote have the time to read. So
no, I'm just joking. But I have a super funny story about that. I was at a bar and somehow I was talking to the bartender about how it just happens, I guess.
Bad idea.
This is super funny. I never like dive into it, but he was just like, oh, you know that if you keep yourself alkaline, like you'll never get cancer because all cancer cells are acidic. And that is true. Like cancer cells are acidic, but it's like, dude, you didn't just solve cancer.
Oh, brother, like you just came up with the solution. Go tell,
hey, brother.
Yeah, go tell the government or someone. I don't know.
Yeah. It's just have you ever listened to Brad Schoenfeld on a podcast?
I have definitely listened to Brad. I have not listened to him recently, but I'm assuming that he, based on the way that I see him navigate social media, like he does a really good job from what I've seen. When people make very strongly worded posts, specifically citing research that he's done, he's like, bro, like I'm the researcher. And this is here's the context for this.
He's super refreshing. I listened to him with Eugene Teo, who's also a great guy to listen to, but super refreshing to hear his perspective because everything is like you would hear someone literally take a study and be like, length and partials are the shit. And he's just like, yeah, so it looks like for the hamstrings that length and partials may slightly increase muscle growth. And you're like, wow, that guy is thorough, you know?
Yeah. And it really says something, by the way, because this will happen a lot when I'm doing Instagram lives, is people will ask a question like, what's the best triceps exercise? And then they'll get mad at me for answering the question with like any degree of nuance, right? So this really speaks to, I think, the broader issue with what we call education, which is we're all taught, and this is just a limitation of like formal education, that you can take a test and you can write an answer, and that answer either has a check next to it or it has an X next to it. There's no room for teaching nuance. There's no room for context, which to some degree, and to many teachers that I had credit, teachers should give partial credit and say, hey, this part of the question was, maybe more correct or more contextually appropriate, but this other part really fell short and this is why, right? Like that's really what education is. And I think that a lot of people, because they, I wasn't someone necessarily who was awesome in school, but I was definitely well above average. And I always appreciated when teachers would sort of teach gray areas, because I had a feeling that like, this is something that's very difficult to teach in and of itself in a sort of meta way, but it's very difficult to teach someone that the gray area is where truth mostly lives, because it's just a lot more uncomfortable and it's a lot more tedious. But I think that the only way that people can end up in an actually educated place is if they just focus on spending time on things like context, which is essentially just another way to say, where are the exceptions to these rules that I think that I understand?
Yeah. It would be interesting. I have never taken it. I'm sure I have, but most of the exams I've not taken have not been like this. But the exams where all the answers are right, but there's one that's the most right. Because that is like the epitome of what you're asking, right? It's like there is probably a best tricep exercise in a unique circumstance, but the whole idea is it's the whole unique circumstance. So you have these 30 options and they're all right answers. But the question is, what is the most right answer given the time and place that you're at?
Yeah. And maybe to give an example of that and to piggyback off of it, I just filmed that I'm going to edit, like, I'm trying to do a little bit more long form content on YouTube.
Yeah, it's dope. Been watching.
Thank you. Just because I think that, the people that will find that and like it are also going to be the people that likely invest the most in my content and the products that I have to sell. So I'm going to start doing that more. It's also fun just to figure things out. But you'll often see videos that are titled something like, what is the best biceps exercise? And I think that to answer, and I'm going to use that title, by the way, because it's a great title, right? But the first thing that I say in the video is curls are the best exercise. Now let's talk about what are the 30 different curling variations that you can do, because saying that curls are the best biceps exercise is probably the truth, right? Like what else are you
definitively the truth,
right? What else are you gonna do? You're gonna do leg extensions? I don't think so. So so in that particular context, then from curls, I can go on to explain the nuances of the different curls, the muscle lengths within the curls, the resistance profiles, whatever else. but you cannot, you can't just stop there, right? You can't just, you might not be wrong, and that might be very, very helpful to someone who has never learned about any of this stuff. But if you actually, again, as we're really talking about here, we're talking about education. We're not talking about, what Tom Purvis likes to call soundbite science, which is most of what I think we see, if you can even call it that. I think that's a little generous even to use the word science. It's really just sound bites on social media.
Soundbite yelling a lot of the time.
Yeah, exactly.
So I got last couple questions for you. You got a fun one and a tough one. What do you want to go for?
Tough.
Tough. All right.
Well, both.
Yeah. We'll start with that.
Tough first. Yeah.
You've stated yourself, and I think pretty much everyone goes through this when they're going through their lifting journey at some point, but you just, you want to be better than yourself. You just look in the mirror. You're like, I should be this. You're comparing yourself to other people, because that's really you can't compare yourself to your future bigger self, because doesn't exist yet. And
also, just sorry to interrupt, I want to say one thing on that. People often say, compare yourself, to yesterday, or compare yourself to last year. And there are just that gives us the impression that we're able to look back on history clearly and sort of in an unmuddied way. So I do think that looking back and comparing yourself to your old self is more helpful than comparing yourself to other people or the imagined future self. But I also don't really think that either of those things are practically helpful for people, at least not in my experience. It's very hard to do.
Yeah. I think that's one of the benefits of taking pictures, though, I would say. So you have same place, same time. It's like, all right, I look back, and usually this is the whole idea. The question is like dealing with body dysmorphia, and I don't necessarily think we have clinical body dysmorphia, but I think everyone has some degree of it. But it's like I don't know, I could take a picture of you from last year and right now, and I'm gonna be like, oh dude, Ben, your fucking lats are popping, your biceps look great, and you'd be like, dude, I look like dog shit. There we go. Flex for that's gonna be the thumbnail right there.
Yeah, great.
So what is your advice? Like, how do you handle the discomfort of dissatisfaction with yourself? And it can getting you across from just outside of muscles in the gym too.
Yeah, really good question. This is something I've thought a lot about but have never really spoken about, so that is a tough question, and I'll try to do my best. I think that dissatisfaction with the self is both a feature of being a person and also a bug. It's a feature in that it is the thing that drives you forward, and it is a bug when that motivating driver turns into something in excess volume. So I think that it's really not about trying. It's not to me, because I think the typical direction that this goes is like, you need to find a way to be satisfied with yourself. And I don't really think that lands for most people. I think that's very difficult to understand intuitively. And it's very difficult to practically apply. Like, okay, so if I'm good with myself, like I'll just chill here, I'll just do my breathing exercises, and I'll just be in the moment, right? No, that doesn't really land for most people. So for me, it's not about trying to become satisfied with myself. It's about managing the balance between the satisfaction and the dissatisfaction. And I've noticed in myself that there are certain days, that there are certain weeks, certain months, certain time periods where I feel very satisfied with myself, where I still have that same motivation that I've always had. It's not like the motivation and the discipline, or whatever you want to call it, whatever buzzword you want to use, it's not like that goes away, but it does tend to, I think, be disrupted in cases where that satisfaction either moves into like this hyperinflated direction where people become narcissistic. And I think it also becomes disrupted when people are too dissatisfied and they're too discouraged, right? So it's not really about satisfaction or dissatisfaction. It's how much are these things weighed against one another, and are either one of these things sort of at their extremes? Because I think the extremes in either direction are where people get into trouble. It's not sort of in the natural ebb and flow, somewhere in the middle. And so I think that, to be honest, that realization was just realizing that and being aware of that was the biggest thing for me, which is there are going to be certain times where I feel good about myself, and there are going to be other times where I feel like shit about myself. And neither one of those things I have to take as reality. I can more just try to take a step back and look at both of them as both features and bugs of the system. And as long as those two things don't start to sort of move toward either end of the extreme, I think that I'm in a good place, regardless of whether I'm dissatisfied or whether I'm satisfied, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Peterson talks about something similar a lot, where if, and this is a really interesting parallel that you made between, you don't like, you if you are too satisfied, you become narcissistic, and in that light, like you don't have any reason to step outside the circle. You don't have any reason to learn more, to your Warren Buffett analogy. Whereas if you are too dissatisfied, you end up at the same place, right? Because you also don't have any reason to move forward, because you're basically narcissistically lost. Right? Everything's pointless. I'm never going to grow any muscle. I'm fucked, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how you're saying, like, you have to understand that they're both a bug and a feature. You have to land in the middle, where you understand that there is a better outcome potentially tomorrow, and you should be moving forward from there, even though you might not be satisfied where you are today. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah, spot on. And I think that goes for any emotion that you feel. So, if you wake up like this morning, take this morning, for example. This morning I woke up, just wasn't really feeling it. Wasn't really feeling good about myself. Wasn't particularly energized or motivated. And I think a previous version of me would have started to panic about my life circumstance. Am I doing what I should be doing? Should I be doing more? Am I doing too much? Blah, blah, blah. And I just, instead of trying to make a judgment about that, I just kind of sat with it. And by noon, it went away. And after my lift, or during my lift, which was at noon, then I felt happier. I felt more energized. I felt really good about myself. And so if you take either one of those scenarios as this is the way that things are, then you start to move into panic mode in both cases, or overexcitement in the case of like feeling happy, where you start to imagine that like, oh, this is now my new reality where I'm happy and excited and nothing can interrupt that. And so just simply being aware, it sounds kind of woo woo, right? But simply being aware of both instances and not making any strong judgments about either instance in the positive or the negative direction, I think is what allows that forward motion. Because ultimately the forward motion is really, I think, where the icing on the cake is, right? Or where the goal actually is the outcome that you should be quote unquote measuring is the direction that you're moving in, not necessarily any individual point along the spectrum of that direction.
You mentioned off camera before that you've kind of pulled back a little bit on lifting. You're no longer hitting the 6-7 days a week.
Oh, listen, man, I'm still fucking, look at this tan line.
Oh, we know, baby. We know. We can tell. Don't worry. That, it's not your whole life anymore, at least. Where, and I think I'm kind of getting to the same point, but what led you to that realization that you were like, all right, I don't need to live for the gym anymore. I can kind of do things outside the gym and strategize and prioritize other things, because for whatever reason, maybe you don't care about building muscle, or maybe you're starting to get to the point where you're satisfied with your physique.
So a couple things. The first that I'll start with is the last that you mentioned, which is a lot of people have the conceptualization that there's this sort of never-ending body dysmorphic thing that occurs when you're lifting. And for me, the last year or so, I have landed in a place where I'm genuinely like happy for the first time with the way that I look. And over the last year, I have not felt the desire to get bigger, get more lean. I'm always, of course, conscious of the way that I look because I care about it, and I think that's fine. But I've just no longer put as much weight on it, because I'm like, like this is something that I'm fairly happy with. Of course, it could always improve, whatever, but it's not something that drives me. I think that what has changed, and to contextualize what you said, because people didn't really hear it, the sort of cliff notes of it was just when I was, we'll say 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, I was hyper obsessed with the gym. I couldn't miss a day. If I missed a day, it was awful. I needed it for emotional regulation. And then over the last couple of years, that has sort of changed. And the reason that it changed is not because I had some, profound realization. It was actually just because my priorities shifted as a consequence of all the other things that were happening in my life. So, for example, during that sort of transition phase from, middle toward end of college, toward after college, I really started to prioritize my learning a lot more to just a large degree, where the learning would actually take priority over the gym. So if I only had 3 hours and I was like, okay, I want to spend time learning this thing and I want to spend time lifting, a previous version of me would have spent 2 hours lifting and 1 hour reading. Whereas now I spend 2 hours reading and 1 hour lifting. And that's a trade-off that for me is worth it, because I've clearly identified that priority. So for me, it's really a matter, or it has been a matter of what is the priority. And insofar as, my gym experience now exists, I use the gym much more as an avenue for fun than I used to, where I'm constantly exploring. Walking into the gym, I almost am hoping that the piece of equipment that I was going to use is taken, or someone is using it for too long of a period of time, because that means I have to figure something else out. Even if no one's in the gym on that day, right, or very few people, I'm always looking to sort of find ways to learn something new, experiment, investigate with something new. And I think, to the point that I was talking about earlier, just about expanding that circle of competence, I think that's how you do that. You do that just by means of finding what is fun for you and what you're curious about. And what I've been curious about in recent years just so happens to have been more the educational side of things than just getting bigger and bigger and bigger to no end. And maybe just one piece of practical advice that I can give to people who are sort of in this body dysmorphic tilting phase is, the simplest and most effective solution for me has been to drastically limit social media, because 99.9% of the shitty feelings that you have about your physique are because you're constantly looking at other people who have been training for 2 decades and taking drugs for a decade, which is clearly not a rational comparison to anyone that takes a second to think about it, right? But to you and to your sort of self-involved person, it's something that is like the point of comparison that you need to get to. So a very practical recommendation that I have for people, something that's concrete, is whatever amount of times that you click a social media icon on your phone is during a day, just on the first week, just cut it in half, right? And then just like see what happens to your brain. It's like, sometimes it's embarrassing to admit, but the amount of benefit that I have received from limiting how many times I press that button, nowadays I limit pressing Instagram to between 2 and 4 times a day now, maybe
Wow.
2 and 5. And that has drastically reduced over time, and it's drastically improved. And I think it's a big part of what has contributed to me not feeling like shit about my body.
That's awesome. Do you, and I would add on to that, just half joking, but don't go to a pro bodybuilder gym where everyone is on steroids and been lifting for 2 decades. That's it's just Instagram and a gym.
Yeah.
Do you use any apps or anything to prevent you from clicking the button, or you just hard nose it? There we go.
Yep.
I got a quote for you. I think you'll really like. Or did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say that, like, I realize that that may not be easy for everyone, and it wasn't necessarily easy for me, but I've always had a very, I'll say, pathological ability to do things cold turkey. For whatever reason, just even since I was little, it was like, in high school, I'll give one example where pretty much every night of football season, I would end my day with like a bowl of ice cream, because my dad told me that like I needed to not lose weight. So I was like, oh, my dad knows best. I'm going to eat a bowl of ice cream. But like I was overweight. Like I was 200 pounds, at pretty much the same height that I am now. And I did not, I in terms of my athletic ability and how I could perform, it didn't seem to impact anything too much. But looking back, I was definitely overweight. And so one day I was basically just like, I'm going into college. I want to lose 20 or 30 pounds. I just stopped eating ice cream for like 6 months. I stopped eating nachos. I stopped eating all junk food. I basically ate, grilled chicken and rice, and that was not a problem for me. So I don't know why that is. I can't explain it. I'm not going to attribute it to any skill that I built, right? It was just something that was innate. So if you're one of those people, then you can probably do the cold turkey, Instagram thing. But if you're not, like, you should definitely recommend some tools for people that auto regulate time on those apps if you know of any.
Yeah, there are some good ones. I have never used one, but I think I'm more of a cold turkey kind of person. So if I know that I'm winning, like by not pressing the button, I have that frame set chip, which you've kind of just provided to me. I think I'll do better off. I think you'll like this quote. You ever heard of Josh Waitkins?
Yes. The Art of Learning.
You read it?
Yeah. 100%.
Phenomenal book. It is rarely a mysterious technique that drives us to the top, but rather a profound mastery of what may well be a basic skill set. In the end, mastery involves discovering the most resonant information and integrating it so deeply and fully, it disappears and allows us to fly.
Oh, God. Give me chills. I won't say that I'm aroused, but I'm about as close to it as one can get. Yeah, that book was awesome, and I didn't expect it at all to be what it was about. I would highly recommend it for anyone who has the time. And I think to that, I think that quote can be applied practically. In other words, like, how do you get to that point? I think that you get to that point by just following what you're curious about. It sounds kind of trite and cliche, but anything that you're deeply interested about, you will just be. It's kind of like when people ask me the common question of where should I get started, learning all this anatomy stuff. And that's a similar question that I had when I was first starting out. And so usually I would give very specific answers. I would say, hey, practically speaking, here's a great resource, blah, blah, blah. But now I just ask a question instead. And I say, well, what like part of the body are you curious about? Because 9 out of 10 times, if someone is actually curious, then they will be able to seek the path themselves. And that is the path that it has no end, right? To what we've been sort of describing, where, in this particular case, if you're interested in the biceps, which most people are, just Google biceps. What can you learn about the biceps? And ultimately, you'll discover that the biceps cross, three joints: the forearm, the elbow, and the shoulder. And you can pick any one of those joints. And then if you pick any one of those joints, all of a sudden you have 20 other muscles that surround those other joints, and 20 muscles that surround the connecting joints, and so on and so on and so on. And so you just end up in a place where you have followed your curiosity so intensely that you now have this entire circle, right, of competence that you've arrived at, and you didn't even really do any of it necessarily intentionally. You were just kind of following the path. So I'm a very strong believer that if you really don't have a curiosity about something, in many cases, it's probably not the best idea to try to invest a bunch of time learning about it. And it's probably a better case to learn from someone who can really concretely summarize the topic for you. And it's better that you just sort of pursue what you are actually curious about through your own sort of means and through your own avenue to sort of optimize for that quote.
I was going to disagree with you there, but I think you contextualize it very well, because you said, there's your favorite word too, fisherman.
Yep, there you go.
Because you said so if I'm not really into lifting mechanics, I want to learn more about the bicep anatomy, I can just go to your account and kind of outsource the need. But I will say there are certain things that I think are worthwhile doing. Like, I don't know, when you're a kid, and this is obviously pretty relevant now because no one handwrites anymore, but you need to put in the time and effort to learn how to handwrite. And you might not like it, but it may have paid dividend in your fine motor skills for later on. So it might be worthwhile to invest in, especially if someone like Ben is not around. Like, all right, I'm going to spend an hour studying anatomy for the next 6 months so I can really gain a basic understanding, and this will be fruitful towards my actual interest as long as it's adjacent to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are certain things I think in terms of life that are skills that you might not necessarily be passionate about, but will, like for me, becoming a better communicator, not necessarily I want to be a better communicator. I don't necessarily want to practice being a better communicator, but it's a means to an end.
Right. Yeah. And it sort of feeds your curiosity as we're doing right now, right, in another area. So I do think I totally agree. And I think that ultimately, if the road does lead back to some fundamental curiosity, it's probably a lot easier for people to pursue those things. A good example, or relevant example in my case, is like nutrition. I could give two shits about nutrition, but I have learned from people enough to kind of know the very, very basics of like, hey, if I want to lose weight, here's what I do. If I want to gain weight, here's what I do. Here's generally the things that I probably should be eating. Here's the things that I maybe should stay away from. Not all the time, but maybe most of the time, right? I know the very, very sort of top of the, or tip of the iceberg layer of that stuff, but I have no fucking desire to go to any degree of depth in any of that stuff. And, it's interesting because topics like programming are directly relevant to exercise, but I also don't care about programming very much. And so the way that I learn about programming is just through my own application. That's pretty much it. Like, I've read Eric Helms's books on it. I consume the podcast that Eric Helms does on programming related topics. He distills the research. He gives it to me in a very sort of simple, digestible way. And that's about the length that I go through, only because it's sort of tangentially related to, the main curiosity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's super interesting because I had a very similar path to you, but to me, like, nutrition was adjacent to lifting. So I was like, I love nutrition now. And it wasn't something I started with. And then I got into endocrinology, how that stuff works, and something I haven't diven too deep into in the steroid realm, just because I don't know, don't really intend on doing steroids, but I always just kind of have one topic that led to another that I keep diving into, which is part of everyone says like, and I love you said this before basically, but Hormozy said this, and I think Gary Vee. It's like don't necessarily try and niche down if it's not true to who you are.
Yeah, it's like niching down unnecessarily is just helpful to no one. And it's not only is it not helpful to no one, or yeah, it's not helpful to anyone. It's not helpful to anyone. And the reason it isn't is because if you are not interested in the niche, then you will not be able to put effort into discovering things about the niche. And, if you are, it's probably not going to be, for a very long time, right? It's kind of like, what are the, I think this was maybe a Hormozy thing. Who knows? Hormozy, fishing, all this is coming up a lot. But it's like, what are the things that you find easy, that other people find to be, more difficult?
It's Naval Ravikant. What are the things that are play to you that's worked to everyone else?
Yeah,
or something along those lines.
Exactly. And that's just another way to say, what are you curious about, right?
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. Do you think, so Mike Israetel, who I really like too, is super entertaining. I think he's kind of come into his own recently. Like just makes a bunch of sex jokes. I think it's super fun. It's cool to see that stuff. He doesn't get really nitty gritty and specific with the individual divisions of the pecs and things like that. He's kind of just like, lats, upper back, pull downs, rhomboids. Do you think, I think there is merit to the not over specificity. I think there is merit to the high degree of specificity where it's like, let's target the inner and outer lats or the upper and lower lats, whatever. But what kind of result are we seeing there? Like how significant of a difference do you think it makes to target the lower lats and the upper lats and the upper back versus just doing a pull down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that Mike does a great job of general distillation, right? Because that's who he's talking about. And his target is so big that he, in the context of exercise mechanics, he hits the target that he's trying to hit because his audience can only really consume that sort of generalized information. Maybe not everyone in his audience, obviously, it's a very big audience, but overall, he does a good job in contextualizing most things in relationship to exercise mechanics. And most of the things that he says in terms of what he recommends, I don't disagree with. I probably agree with 90% plus. Now, in terms of application and how he exercises and the way that it ends up looking might be a little different, but at least from a communication standpoint, I agree with Mike on, more topics than I disagree with Mike on. I would say in the context of this question, and the question is really like, how specific do you need to be in dividing muscles like the lats, muscles like the glutes, hamstrings, whatever? If the outcome that you are measuring this question in relationship to is hypertrophy, the answer is you probably don't need to be that specific. But hypertrophy is one outcome that exists within the framework of a multitude of outcomes, one of which is, we'll say, orthopedic health, joint health. So I think that when you measure these things in relationship to something like orthopedic health, joint health, and long-term joint health, right? Because we're not talking about a single day. We're talking about an accumulation of thousands of reps and thousands of sets over hopefully long periods of time. We're talking about, I think, a much different frame in the question. And I think that's where I would disagree with the general notion that it's not that important, because I think it's very, very important just in the way that a lot of people don't talk about it in terms of in the frame. So, and I think that is, we'll say, harmful to only communicate the hypertrophy frame, because hypertrophy and being able to train only exists within a context where you're not injured. And if you talk to, anyone who's been training really for any length of time, the number one thing that holds people back is injury, right? It's like just not being able to train at all, not being able to train as hard as you want, as often as you want, with enough volume, right, to continue to grow. And that just continues to scale in its importance over time. So if the question is framed to hypertrophy, I would say probably not much of a difference. But if the question is framed to general health and total stress that you're putting on any joint in a given time frame, then all of a sudden I think it becomes much more important. And the other thing that I'll add to that as a general note is that I think that with this conversation, people are being a lot more specific than they think using these generalized terms, right? So a couple examples that you mentioned were like upper lats versus lower lats, right? But then you also mentioned rows and pull downs. Well, we only arrive at the answer of rows and pull downs because we're actually trying to differentiate the stimulus of what we're doing, right? If it was all just the same, we would just do 50 sets of rows every week and we would just cross our fingers and hope for the best. But no one is doing that, right? So everyone to some degree is applying this principle of precision and specificity, but they might just not be aware specifically of the fact that they're doing that to begin with. And that's evidenced in the fact that we don't just do one exercise for every muscle group, right? And that obviously has implications in relationship to both the hypertrophy frame and then also the orthopedic health frame.
That was a great answer.
Thanks, man.
All right, last question, fun one for you, and I think you'll appreciate this. Just casual flex.
Uh-oh.
I think one of the worst questions, and also something our favorite podcaster asks a lot of the time, is if you can only pick 10 exercises.
Oh, I fucking knew it.
It's the worst one. No, I'm not giving you. I have a twist for you. You're building a home gym. You got 10 things you can put into it.
Oh, that's so much better. Holy shit.
So much better.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Wow, you should make a recommendation to Chris about this question.
I'll have my people contact his people.
You know what, actually? You know why I think it's going to be... This sounds self-inflated, okay? But if someone is still listening an hour and 40 minutes in, I'm okay with some self-inflated comments. I think that if Chris were to ask this question to his guests, I don't think that his guests would necessarily have the tools to navigate this question like logically, right? Because anyone can just say, I've done these exercises and here's what I look like. But to start to talk about like machines and implements, you actually have to sort of be working backward in a little bit of a logical sequence. So that's why I'm giving you a compliment about the reframe of that question.
Appreciate it.
Okay. So I'm just going to jot this down so I make sure I'm not missing any big things. So the first one would be a prime functional trainer. Okay. The second one would be a Cybex leg extension. The third one would be a Cybex seated leg curl. The fourth one would be a Smith machine. The fifth one would be a Rogue pull down. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The next one would be a bench. Jesus Christ, I almost forgot a bench. The seventh one.
You can put dumbbell set as one too if you want.
I don't fucking care about dumbbells. Do I need to, like, if I say an accessory like a daisy chain, does that count?
No.
All right, so daisy chain is going over as like, just I need to throw that in there. Daisy chains, things like straps, whatever. Does those count? So I've had 6. Okay, what am I missing? Okay. Ooh. I would say the Nautilus pull down as my 7th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'm assuming also that we don't need to include attachments, right? Like ropes and whatever. Okay, cool. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is why this is good, is because I'm starting to need to think about a little bit more. Okay. I'll just generalize this and say a 45-degree leg press.
Okay.
I won't be specific about brand, although one of my favorites is probably the Cybex or the Atlantis 45-degree, just
the
for
old
anyone
Cybex
who's
is sick.
Yeah.
So I would have gone for a hack squat with the adjustable back plate, so you can do glutes and calves.
So I would say that you can accomplish most of what you need to on a hack squat with a leg press, and I prefer the leg press because it's not shoulder loaded.
That's fair.
That's a personal preference thing. Okay, so that's 8, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, regional curls, arms, delts, abs. 2 more abs. Ooh, okay. Atlantis hyperextension.
For what? For glute? Really?
Yep. Glutes, hamstrings, abs, erectors. You could do curls on there. You could do triceps extensions on there as an anchor. Like so I'm listing so many of these things as like, what are the alternative uses? So like a Smith machine, you could train your entire body, on a fucking Smith machine. And the Atlantis Hyper, it just has so many different angles that you can use that it's so versatile.
Okay, so not a 45-degree extension, like a hyper extension.
Yeah, so a hyperextension, which is technically you can make it 45 degrees, but I think it goes up to 60 and all the
Okay.
way down to like 30. So that's 9, right? 1, 2, 3,
Yep.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I've got glutes, hamstrings. Oh my god. And well, let me just double check this. Glutes. Oh, and then a adduction abduction machine.
Damn.
Right? Because I got my calves covered with the leg press. So, you know, seated calf, I could probably jerry rig on the Smith if I needed to.
You do it on
Tibialis
a hamstring
anterior.
curl too, or a lying hamstring curl.
Yeah, don't need the lying hamstring curl. If I wanted to do the lying hamstring curl, I could do it backwards on the leg extension. So, little trick for all you who don't have a lying leg curl. And yeah, so glutes were good, calves good, quads good, hamstrings good, erectors, abs good, obliques good, chests good, lats good, delts good.
Awesome.
And you know, I probably could have stopped the answer at prime functional trainer, but I gave you the humor of listing the other 9.
Well, I appreciate it. Ben, that was awesome. Thank you very much for taking time. Any last words?
No, man, this was a great conversation, and I have definitely noticed a difference in your podcasting ability from a year ago. So kudos to you in the positive direction, not the negative direction. So yeah, would love to do this again, and maybe we just do one a year or one every couple months. Who cares? You know, maximize the time you spend listening to me ramble. But yeah, really enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Till next time, guys. Be good.